What is it? Morning Roxy Soxy? What is it? It's kind of lunchtime-ish over here.
It's the witching hour right now. 6:30.
I hate the witching. I literally have, I realized, like I said to my husband, I was like, I'm not really that anxious during the day until it gets to 5 p.m. 5 p.m. hits and I have like a total panic and I just like want to check myself into the bedroom and not want to talk to anyone. Because witching hour is like real.
Yes. Wouldn't that be like the nicest thing if you literally at 5 o'clock could check yourself into your bedroom and just be like, I'm done. Like,
what do you mean? Like, you wish? I kind of do that.
Oh, I'm so jealous.
I just check the fuck out. I'm just like, husband, I'm going. No, I don't. It just depends on my day and my mood. But yesterday I was on the kids full on, but like the day before I just checked out.
Oh, God. Sometimes you just need that though. You just need to like be away and like not have to deal and to take a minute, right?
And you know why? It's because COVID and everything that's been going on, which is why we got this amazing expert on this show that is coming up right after this, after our drivel of conversation in the beginning, which is actually some of my favorite stuff that we do.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, COVID has just changed the world forever. I mean, it's definitely changed my life. It's changed probably everyone's life. In the beginning of COVID, and tell me how you felt about this, I thought, you know what? It's not going to change my life that much. Didn't you think that? Didn't you think like, oh, it's like this thing that kind of affects people who are older and we're not that old yet. And it's not really going to affect our children or anything like that. And then I didn't realize how not only was it going to affect our lives and everyone's lives, but so much in how much it was going to affect it.
Yes. And for like the length of time too, because I think when we first kind of started this, we thought, okay, it's going to be like a 2-week sort of a thing where we like all lock down and, it'll go away and then things will be better. And here we are cut to almost 2 years later and it's still out there and there are still people getting really sick. And so I think, it totally changed things like the dynamic. I mean, Tammin, don't you remember that last week, you and I, before we went into lockdown, we were recording our podcast in the studio and we were like, this is not going to be a big deal. And now look where we are.
And our friend Jamie was like, this is going to be, and I remember sitting at dinner with you going, Jamie, I was like, I am not going to let something like this it's not gonna, I'm like, come on, I'm not afraid of viruses. So little did I know. And I think there's a lot of fear, obviously, surrounding, what's going on with COVID and vaccines. And, I think it's understood. You and I are both fully vaxxed and, but I'm not going to lie. I was nervous.
Were you?
I remember I got the call. This was earlier on though, when the vaccines just started to become available for us. And I remember it was March 2021. And that was before anyone was really vaccinated. And my husband said, we got an appointment and we're going. And I was nervous. I was nervous because sometimes you don't know what to believe. And yes, I absolutely believe in science, but there's so much information and so much misinformation that sometimes your brain does go down that road. And I know you come from a medical family, so you kind of just look to your dad and probably think that he has the answers, which he, I'm sure, does. But when you're not from a medical family, you have a lot coming at you and you don't know the right decision and it's scary. It's a very scary time. So when I feel fear, I'm like, okay, let's talk about it. Let's have a conversation. Let's debate the different issues. Not that there's really much of a debate because I think everyone in this podcast is on the same side.
I think it's really important because like you're saying, there's so much misinformation out there and the whole thing became like really politicized and it became like us against them or them against us. And it's like turned into this whole thing where I think that people don't even really know like what they're fighting about anymore. They just think it's like political sides and it's all about, gaining power and this and that. And they're not looking at it like from a public health perspective, which is scary. So I'm so glad.
Without further ado, and I hope I say this beautiful woman's name.
How much are we going to bet? How much are we going to bet?
Nini Munoz. Oh, I probably got it wrong. She can fix it.
You came close.
I came close. She is a science communicator and she sees the world through data and risk analysis, which is a part of my brain that I need to start seeing the world through. And it's more about data over fear. And that's, I think, what we need to be talking about right now, because, I said this on my DMs the other day. I was like, it's all about risk analysis for me. And yes, everything has a risk, but it's about which one is going to be, is going to show up more in your life. So thank you so much for being here. We have a million conversations, a million questions from a million people. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And, and so I always tell this to people, whether it's couples or people that have just different opinions on a subject. It really comes from people's different perceptions of risk. Everybody has a different perception of risk. And in order for us to even start to address some of these concerns and start really kind of dismantling a lot of the misinformation, the first thing that we have to do is we have to understand what people's perception of risk is. Otherwise, you just won't get through. You really won't. And that requires, a bit of empathy and just sometimes history, especially in the US where I am, people have different reasons for vaccine hesitancy and vaccine resistant. And I usually draw a distinction between them both. Vaccine hesitant are more people that are kind of waiting and seeing, maybe they're unsure. And then of course, you've got people who are just absolutely like, no way, I'm not getting this vaccine. And as Roxy was mentioning, it was highly politicized, which is really unfortunate because you don't want to do that with public health because it affects everybody. It affects the whole community. There's like a downstream effect. We're seeing it now here, more and more stories of people who are not able to get to a hospital because hospitals are overwhelmed, or of healthcare workers who are just quitting. And that results in a shortage that affects everybody in the community. So definitely a lot of what I do is understanding people's perception of risk and then kind of telling a story around that. Other than instead of me coming in and saying, well, here's the science, here's the data, blah, blah, blah. I don't like that because it doesn't get through. And I know that from my years teaching, because I used to teach at Cornell for like over a decade. I used to teach really complex subjects, and sometimes I couldn't get through in a certain way. But if I kind of changed my tune, or if I draw like certain analogies, if I drew certain analogies, then my students would be receptive. So I started to explore different ways of teaching, different ways of learning, and I've taken that experience combined with my professional experience, which is literally designing products and making sure they don't fail. That's all risk analysis, by the way. Like if I design a part for a pilot, I have to make sure that the pilot interprets the part correctly. So it's not just about the design of the product, it's the behavior of whoever is using that part. Because it's kind of fascinating when you do risk analysis on a product. And I've taken the combination of those two things to communicate science. And I use my platform to intersect all these different voices, immunologists, infectious disease researchers, EPIs, to tell a story around people's perception of risk. So it's really just a wonderful kind of almost labor of love for me, just being able to do that. But we have to understand where people are coming from to really, dismantle those fears, because it's a lot of fear. We're looking at fear responses. You were just saying, that's exactly what's happening. You have two ways of responding to emotion. I'm not sure if you know what these are. They're like what we call bottom up, right? So that's from like your amygdala, and then top down, which is through your prefrontal cortex. And the bottom up response is a purely emotional response, like when you're startled. So you don't even process information, you immediately respond with emotion, right? And you can disable that response with information by enabling the prefrontal cortex. So it's kind of like this balance. You kind of need a little bit of this fear to look for the right information. The problem is what happens if you encounter misinformation, and then that keeps driving these neural like feedback loops that keep heightening the fear response, which make you less receptive to the right information. So that's why Nini and the brain, like the whole idea of the account was, let's disable these fear responses. Like that was the original intent with data, but telling a story.
So, we were on a really good trajectory, with vaccines, like at the beginning, like, right. There was like a very high demand, like people really wanting to get in and get the vaccine. And I feel like here now we've sort of hit this bump in the road where it's like, now we have this supply and people are vaccine hesitant or vaccine resistant, and they don't want to get the vaccine. And then, we have this Delta variant that's now come around and people are ending up in the hospital. And I think people are getting confused. They're like, well, wait a minute. I thought if, you were vaccinated, you can't get sick. And there's just all this misinformation going around. So can you kind of clarify that a little bit?
Sure. So there's a couple of points here to address. The first thing is that vaccination is a community effort. We don't say vaccines save lives. We say vaccination saves lives. Like if you think about us growing up, like we've grown up with herd immunity from all these other diseases, right? But we see that if there are communities that fail to vaccinate, you see these outbreaks and they reemerge. So vaccination is a community endeavor, which means we need a lot of people vaccinated to really, really slow down that transmission to a higher degree than where we are. Because in the US, we're like at 54, 55%, and that's not nearly as high as where we need to be. And the second thing to understand is that vaccines are one of the many layers of risk mitigation, and like any other intervention, they are not 100% effective. There's variability in immune responses. With SARS-CoV-2 virus and a COVID-19 infection, we really do see that it's the biggest determinant of a health outcome is really age, because as we age, our immune system changes, and we are seeing that some of the mechanisms of action that are being explored in regards to why do some people get severe disease have to do with delayed responses like interferons and cytokine storms and all that that usually kind of get worse as we age. So that's why we see that big age dependency. So with vaccines, we can imagine that a similar effect is in place where younger people elicit much stronger immune responses. And in fact, when we see some of these risk factors, because there are risks with these vaccines, and we can talk upon what those are, you see it in like the younger cohorts, as opposed to like, an older demographic, they're not as vulnerable to the risks such as myocarditis or, Guillain-Barré syndrome. But we do see that while they have milder side effects, they also probably mount a less robust immune responses. So yeah, and when you have a lot more virus, as we think that's happening, a lot of people have wondered if it's a behavioral response. We really do think that the virus is just replicating a lot faster. With too much virus, it's going to punch through any vaccine. So you're going to get these breakthrough cases. And I love using the analogy of sandbags and a concrete wall, because if you put sandbags in front of your property and you built a concrete wall to help you from a flood, if there's a little bit of water, those sandbags are going to do an A+ job. But as soon as you've got too much water, like those sandbags are not going to hold, right? But as long as you have your concrete wall, your property is going to be okay. And so with immune responses, we see something similar. We have the antibodies, right? Antibodies really are critical to prevent an infection, but we also have a lot of virus with Delta. I mean, we went from a virus that could on average infect 2 to 4 people a few months ago, right? Each person could on average infect 2 to 4. To now, the last, somebody just messaged me, said 7 to 10, I think 6 to 9 was the last one, the last number put out by the CDC. So that's twice as much. I mean, that's huge. And so you can imagine that there's just a lot more virus circulating. So it is more likely we're going to see these breakthrough infections. But for most people that have been vaccinated, they already have that wall built up. So yes, you might get a breakthrough, you might develop mild symptoms, but for most people, you will see that wall will hold up and it'll prevent severe disease, but not for everybody, especially for people who are sadly immunocompromised, organ transplant recipients, people undergoing chemotherapy. And we see that in Israel. If you take a look at the breakthrough data of hospitalized patients in Israel, 40% of them were immunocompromised. So you really see a skew in the older demographic that hasn't mounted those robust immune responses. Those are the people that unfortunately are getting severely ill. But that's also why the booster doses have been authorized. And we see in Israel, it really did make a significant impact in that older demographic. So, they present their data under 60, over 60, under 60, maybe it'll prevent an infection, but under 60, the likelihood of a severe infection if you've been vaccinated are still marginally low. Over 60, we see, that immune response attenuates, but with the latest booster, that the third shot, and I can talk a little bit more about that later, we do really see that it is conferring more protection onto this age group, which is important.
I mean, the biggest questions I get on my DMs are, and I'm a layman, so I try not to answer it and try to funnel people over to you, but is like, if I can get COVID and I can spread COVID, then what's the point of the vaccines? And yet I don't understand why, because what I've learned from all of this is, well, you can still get it, but you're less likely if you get it to pass it to someone else. So the reason to get the vaccine is it keeps you out of the hospital and you're way less likely to spread it to other people. Is that correct?
It is correct, because first, people forget that you cannot transmit a virus you don't have. So vaccines already lower your likelihood of getting an infection in the first place. So just that first layer, right? Statistically, okay. So first of all, you are currently with Delta, you're roughly 5 times less likely to get an infection if you're vaccinated. So that's the first thing. If you do get infected, if you are a breakthrough, you are going to be less contagious for a variety of reasons. So there were, there's been different studies. One of them showed that relative to unvaccinated people, vaccinated people have lower contagious virus. Also, relative to unvaccinated people, people who have been vaccinated, they clear the virus a lot faster, which makes sense because we've got that wall. So people who are unvaccinated have to build that wall. And that's where a lot can go wrong. And you're talking about a lot of virus, which is why we were also seeing an increased risk of hospitalization in some of these younger age groups, because it's very, very different to what we started out with. So aside from the fact that, you're less likely to get an infection, you are less likely to transmit it. But even more importantly, and this is what I think is, to me, like the biggest benefit of vaccinating right now is to relieve the burden on the healthcare system. Right. Because if you cannot get to, it's not just affecting people who get a COVID-19, infection. It's affecting everybody else. And I already see it coming. I already see it coming that we're going to have more diagnoses of all these other conditions because people haven't been able to get to see their doctors. They just haven't. We only have a limited amount of healthcare workers and physicians and frontline workers. So if you burden that system, 2 things happen. Well, first, it sets the stage where if you have a heart attack, you won't be able to find care. But and more importantly, I like to think about the younger generations. I'm like, these are the doctors that are going to that we want them to stay in the workforce. We want them to have the experience. You know why? Because we're aging more. And I always tell people, it's if you compare to where we were the 1900s, and I'll have a great post on this tomorrow, by the way, where I talk about how our health actually has gotten better. We are living longer. That's why when people say, oh, there's more deaths from cancer, I'm like, yeah, well, there's more people living above 70. So what do you expect? Right. And so if we're an aging population. We already know that fertility rates are dropping. Less women are choosing to have children. That's a given. We are aging more. We need experienced healthcare practitioners so we can live that long. And if we're going to burn them out, right? Not only does it put our health at risk, but also much younger generation, children, who are going to grow up and eventually develop chronic diseases, because that's what happens as we age. That's part of aging.
Well, speaking of the children, especially now that you brought it up, there are a lot of questions out there about, especially for children under 10 years old. Tam and I, all of our girls are 7 and under. people are wondering, should we get our kids vaccinated when they're able to be vaccinated, especially like this younger age group, like under 10 years old? What are your thoughts on that? And especially with female children, because there's also something going around about it affecting fertility. Yeah.
We can talk about that. I mean, yeah.
I mean, for the kids, like, if we get our young daughters, vaccinated, will it affect their fertility later on?
And also I want to like add to that, if we're going to talk about the fact that that isn't true, where does this come from? Like, where is this misinformation? Because so many people that I've heard, I've 6 friends who are pregnant who are not getting the shot. And I'm like, well,
I know. And
I don't understand. So let us know.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go back. So to begin with, remember that fertility is, evokes highly emotional responses in women. Mm-hmm. So, anti-vaccine advocates have been using fertility arguments way before COVID-19 vaccines, and I've talked about it. They actually started this with the HPV vaccine. So this goes way back. They know what they're doing. So they know what they're doing when they bring up fertility and the fertility argument. And with the HPV vaccine, they kind of said, oh, well, if it's something that's preventing like a viral infection in the reproductive organs, then it could lead to infertility. And there was really no basis for that, because a vaccine is not a therapeutic. It prevents you from having something. It doesn't clear an HPV, infection once you have it, right? Mm-hmm. And so this was followed up with a poorly designed study. I think her name was Gail DeLong, and she compared, you're going to love this one. She compared highly educated women, older in age, to who are more likely to get the HPV vaccine, to women with less educational attainment who did not get vaccinated. So, and there's a correlation. We know that women that go for like degrees and higher degrees delay having children. And so she compared these two groups and she said, look, those people who are getting vaccinated, the fertility rates are lower. Of course, this was retracted, but you can imagine that they've been doing this for a while. So with COVID-19, what happened early on is, again, because this, I always tell people, like, conspiracies don't have to be true. They just have to be plausible. That's all it takes, that element of possibility. Like, I can start a conspiracy today that says eating too much broccoli could potentially give you cancer. And then I could tell you, because you can't prove to me that that's not true, therefore it must be true, which is what we call the argument from ignorance, which is what they do, right? So it's kind of like saying, you can't prove it to me, so therefore it must be true. So with COVID-19, they picked one protein, like, this is the protein syncytin 1, which is a placental protein that shares a few amino acids with like the spike protein, right? And so from there, they kind of concluded, oh, look, it shares a few amino acids. If you create antibodies for like the spike protein, you're going to create antibodies for this other placental protein, which is untrue, because we have overlapping amino acids of the spike protein with collagen. So anybody that has had a COVID infection would be experiencing like a collagen, disease.
You would look great.
And that's not how it works. Proteins have to fold. So just because you have a few shared amino acid residues doesn't imply that the lock and key mechanism, these proteins are very specific. Antibodies are going to be very, very specific to the protein. And just because you share these residues doesn't imply that it's going to have like the same effect. But of course, as I said, all you need is that, that just plant that seed of doubt, right? Just the plausibility, what if? And then it took a life of its own. And so of course, you saw that it went from there to, oh my goodness, women are losing their babies when they're getting vaccinated, which is not true, because what one does is one looks at the background rates of the population. Most women that I've known, myself included, have had a pregnancy loss. It's extremely traumatic.
Yeah, I've had a couple.
Yeah, and they also take advantage of that because we are in a very vulnerable state. I remember when I had like my pregnancy loss, I think I was crying for like 2 months. You're in a very vulnerable state, and you're in a state where you are going to be more emotional. So again, talking about that, bottom up, top down system. So that moment, the bottom up system is fully enabled. So it's an emotional response. You're less receptive to information. And that's what they're doing. So they're building up a narrative and of course using like these anecdotes. But the truth is we have absolutely not one shred of evidence to indicate that vaccinating increases your risk for miscarriage or that it causes infertility, because even women who've had COVID have been able to conceive. So we would have seen this already, even with like with the SARS-CoV-2 like infection, even before vaccination. And we didn't observe that in any capacity. But of course it just builds up, right? Then the next thing you have like, oh, there's this study that shows, bits of like the spike protein in the reproductive organs. And then they're citing a study on a rat that receives 400 times the dose that we get, right? And so a lot of these studies really get taken out of context, and you really have to look at what we call like the large scale population data. So the epidemiological data, what does it say? We see it over and over. Women who have been vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine and are either wanting to conceive or are at some point in the journey of their pregnancy are not experiencing any more severe adverse outcomes relative to the baseline population. And we have like numerous studies. I think I must have summarized like 16 of them in a post that I did a couple of weeks ago with a fertility doctor.
Yes, I read that one. Yeah. I save all your posts and then I send them to people.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate because pregnant women are at high risk for a severe COVID-19 outcome. And I don't really like to, I don't like to put this kind of stuff on my stories, like, some of the messages that I get from OBGYNs and what they're saying, because I also don't want to like use fear, part of what I'm trying to do is to just provide information and understand people's perception of risk and understand where they're coming from and provide them with the data. But some of the stories that I'm really hearing about in the background, because we all talk amongst ourselves, different science communicators, some of the things that I'm hearing are really disheartening and are really traumatic. And as far as, women not only losing their child, but they're losing their lives on a ventilator because they have not gotten a COVID-19 vaccine.
And what about with the kids, like these kids under 10, should we vaccinate them when they become available?
I think, yeah. So I think it comes down to like the risk versus benefit, right? I mean, any intervention, and you really have to look at it that way, right? Risk, children are at a lower risk. The risk is not zero, right? And I think this is where I think that, as a parent, you also want to weigh what that means to you. Like, what does it mean to you? Like, are you willing, to take this risk, or are you willing to take that? The bigger concern, I think the biggest concern we have with our mRNA vaccines is the risk of myocarditis, which is a very real risk. We've identified it. Currently, we see it in a bit of an older demographic, like 16 to 17-year-olds, and then it kind of, tapers off a bit. So it's kind of around the idea of we have to use pharmacovigilance and keep track of it, because, ultimately the myocarditis is very mild and self-resolving. But, I'm not a parent, but I can understand a parent when a parent might be like, I don't know that I want to do that. I don't know, especially if the risk of, of a severe COVID outcome is less likely. Now, what worries me a little bit about the pediatric population is, we're learning more and more about this virus every day, right? And, like with HPV, an example, like we eventually found out, oh, wow, it increases your risk of cervical cancer. And so with these viruses, the question then becomes, what could happen in that demographic, right? If they have like a COVID-19 if they have COVID-19 disease or a SARS-CoV-2 like infection, like, yes, they are less likely to have a severe outcome. They're probably going to be fine in a couple of days to like a week. But what could happen later on, right? And the reason why I really, highlight the pediatric population is because if you think about it, they've got more years of life left to live. And so one way of thinking about it is like, it's just a bigger loss for that demographic if they have to live with, a comorbidity that might come up later on. With myocarditis, for instance, we know that the risk of myocarditis from COVID-19 is much higher than with a vaccine. So it's like, oh, okay, so it varies by age group. I always try to teach people, you got to really look at it by age group because each age group is different. You got to stratify it. But that is like one of the concerns that I have. When I talked to our local pulmonologist, Dr. Sager, he told me, he said, my biggest concern, he said to me, is what's going to happen, even to people who have had a mild infection, what's going to happen like 10 or 20 years down the road? Am I going to be seeing people with like emphysema and with all these other complications? We already know that dementia seems to be impacted. Like it seems to increase the risk of neurological disorders. So we see increased incidence of tinnitus, the loss of like taste and smell for many people. I have family that haven't really regained their taste since December, and they were perfectly healthy. My
husband, yeah. I think what I'm confused about is like when I grew up, we got vaccines to go and travel. I got the typhoid vaccine to go to parts of Asia. I got vaccines as I grew up, and it wasn't really ever a thing. It wasn't politicized. Maybe we should. I do know of some friends' kids who have had minor issues from a vaccine. One of them had a seizure on the table, which is a febrile seizure, which can happen. So maybe we should have looked more into vaccines back then. But my thought of like believing in science is that I think that vaccines do way more good than they do harm. But then there are some harm that they have done. I mean, can vaccines harm is my first question. And second is, I don't think what we're talking about is the level of like the rate in which they can harm, because we were saying like the blood clots, like you were talking, like AstraZeneca, my parents got AstraZeneca and they were really worried about the blood clots, but they were saying it's like a 0.00001% chance that you could get a blood clot. Whereas in the pill that we take, it's 1 in 100 or something, but no one's really even talking about that. And yet we're making this such a massive deal, because what you're saying, I'm listening to, and I'm like, wow, like maybe I should be nervous. Maybe I shouldn't be nervous. I've really got to look at the data, but isn't the data so minute when it comes to what can actually happen through vaccines, or am I wrong?
No, you're not. It's like the risk of an adverse event from a vaccine is really small. In fact, you're going to love the post that I'm working on for Friday, where I'm comparing the risk of cosmetic procedures with the risk of vaccines. And I'm talking about the distortion. So there's a lot of distortion that happens, in our cognitive ability to interpret risk. We're terrible at calculating risk, right? First of all, like humans. But a lot of it has to do with people's kind of like how they benefit from an intervention. Like with a vaccine, it's like, Seth Berkley, who's like the director of like the Vaccine Alliance, he once said that vaccines are victim of their own success because when they work, you experience nothing but the absence of disease. So it's true. And and also usually, the way the vaccines are being, the way they've been politicized, it's like a requisite, right? You have to get a COVID-19 vaccine. And when I was up for my shot, I was like, oh my God, I'm so ready. Like I felt volunteer. But I can imagine that for people who are less, who are more reluctant, for them it felt more like, so it changes your perception of a risk when something is required versus when something is voluntary. That's the first thing to acknowledge. But the risks of vaccination, they're very small, but they're real. Like, they do exist, and it's important that we acknowledge it, whether or not there could be. The immune system is a bit of like a Pandora's box, right? Like, you can't really, because most of these adverse events result from these immune mediated reactions. It's just really hard to predict who is going to be vulnerable to such an outcome or not. And
when you
really
say small, is there a percentage of what small is? Like, is there a percentage?
Yeah, usually like in the single digits per million. And as far as,
can you say that not what is that?
That would be 0.000001. Right.
Okay, that's why I got the vaccine, to be honest, because I kept saying that in my head. I said, you know what, 0.0000001, and I know that the risk for me to actually get COVID and get very sick was much higher than that. So that was my own risk. That was my own risk assessment.
Yeah, but as I said, it's different for every person. Like, some people may weigh more like the individual risk versus benefit. I've always, for me personally, like, the risks that I always saw, and maybe because my mother was a nurse, was like, I don't want to burn out our healthcare workers. Like, that was always like the from the very beginning of like the pandemic. That's what I saw. I was like, if this workforce gets burned out, and by the way, a lot of them are already burned out because we already have shortages in the US even prior to like the pandemic. If that's a huge risk to the whole community. Every single thing you do, you want to go like skiing, guess what? Tough luck. You can't get into an accident. Like, you get into a car accident, who's going to take care of you? So it increases the risk associated with every single activity that we perceive as risk-free nowadays, because we have access to healthcare. And it's really fascinating. I'm working with an economist from Wharton, and I told them, let's do a little experiment. So I downloaded data on vaccine attitudes. He downloaded the data on GDP per capita, and there's a clear correlation. So wealthier countries are more vaccine hesitant.
Interesting.
Yeah, because we have access to healthcare, because we don't see these diseases. Like, we just don't experience them. So for us, it's more like this foreign threat, right? Like, it's kind of funny, like you were talking about your discussion with your husband, because early on in the pandemic, so I'm Colombian, right? So I grew up like they had to boil water to prevent like dengue and all that. And I came to the US when I went to school. And when this pandemic first started, this is like 2019, December 2019. I saw it coming. My husband didn't. And I was like one of the few people who actually bought toilet paper ahead of schedule.
Yeah, my husband did too.
I actually bought it like in February. And then everybody was like, I can't get any toilet paper. I had like a whole, like I had like boxes stacked up. Because
you're like, I'm rich with toilet paper.
I know, right? I got the new currency. But I saw it, and maybe part of that was, being born and raised in Colombia and being exposed to like, a more fragile, healthcare infrastructure back then, right? Or maybe being more exposed to like the disease. I immediately recognized the threat, and I was like, this thing is coming. Whereas my husband, I remember he was like, oh no, like, he didn't think it was going to make the leap. Whereas I was just like, it's only a matter of time. And I needed to get an appendectomy because I've had like really chronic appendicitis. And I was like, let me get this done. Or at least that's what they tell you, that it's chronic appendicitis. I'll believe that. And so I was like, and so I was just like, and then there was only one surgeon that I wanted, because she's like this petite French woman. And I know that she wasn't just going to slice me open. And she was like, okay, this is like, I'm pretty sure she's going to not leave like a scar. So I only wanted to go in with her because it was laparoscopic. And I was just like looking at the calendar, and I was like, oh my God, I've got to go do this. And I went in and out of the hospital March 16th, 2020. And I remember being home like that day, like that evening. And the first thing that pops into like my, like my phone or local news is that the first patient had been admitted to the hospital in Santa Barbara. Wow. Like that day, because that's exactly what I was trying to avoid. But everybody's perception of risk is entirely different. But yeah, the risk exists. It's really small, but it's something that I, and I have a lot of people in that support my work that have gone through one of these experiences, and it's a totally different conversation, because at that point it's like, you just can't dismiss it. You can't say, oh, like the risk is, really, really, really small. You just can't, it's, to me, that doesn't feel right. I think that where one can engage more is like kind of like saying, we know that there are risks with any intervention, but there really are risks with everything we do in life. Like we could be walking on a sidewalk to be safe, and we could still get run over by like a drunk driver, right? Like you just, it's the only way of living a risk-free life is to cease to exist. And that's just it. And the older we get, the more risk we're going to experience, because we're getting older and we're going to be vulnerable to all these things. And it is the silver lining. If you think about it, public health responses and technology in modern medicine made our lives better. One could argue, okay, we're no longer dying before we turn one. Like 100 years ago, 17% of births resulted in a death within like a year. That's really high. Less than 4% of the population lived to be 65 and over, versus like 17% now. So public health responses made it so that we now get to live longer, but they also opened a window of uncertainty that, think about it, we haven't even been living this long for very long. We don't have all those answers that people want, and we don't sit well with uncertainty. So a lot of what we're seeing also is an effect of public health responses that made our lives better in a really sudden, short amount of period of time. And then there's the uncertainty, right? But overall it's better. We are better off than we were.
And I think too, social media plays such a big part of like all this, right? Because it's like, depending on whose page you're going to or whose post you're looking at, you're getting, one set of information versus another. And I see people post about natural immunity is something that they post about. And they're like, oh no, I'm in my 30s, 40s, I'm relatively young, I'm healthy, I work out, I sleep 9 hours a night, I take zinc, I take vitamin D.
They obviously don't have kids then.
Right, exactly. Their immune system hasn't really been put to the test. But they say they take all these things and they're doing the quote unquote right things, with working out and sleep and eating well and eating veggies. And so they say, oh, well, I have natural immunity, I don't need the vaccine. What do you say to somebody like that? Because I see these things posted rampantly on social media.
I usually remind them of the Spanish flu, where the peak of the mortality was 20 to 40 healthy-year-olds. Like that's most people died. They were 20 to 40-year-olds because immune-mediated responses are highly unpredictable. Yes, there's higher risk with age and COVID. Like, you see different patterns of mortality with different viruses, because different viruses have different machinery and the way they interact with your body and your immune system is different. So in the case of SARS-CoV-2, it has proteins that allow it to hide from like the immune system. So for people where, as you get older and you get more what we call interferon and cytokine dysregulation, that has a big effect, right? So they don't mount the immune response as quickly as they need to. And so, the inflammatory processes continue to kind of expand in the process. And so we see a lot of that, but immune-mediated responses are highly unpredictable, even for a healthy person. And while the risk of a severe COVID outcome that may land you in hospitalization is it's small. Let's use the data that we have. It is really small. There's this other aspect of long COVID, which those figures are not small. Different studies report different things. We see from 10 to 30%. Like living with a comorbidity when you're young, as I said, it's like the younger you are when you hit a comorbidity, the more like, if you think about it, if you want to think about it in terms of like economics, is the value of a statistical life. It's like the more years lost because you have to live with this comorbidity. And so there's that aspect, and that is really unpredictable. As I said, I know a healthy 29-year-old with no underlying conditions, and she still
my husband, yeah.
And then her heart, she still has like weird heart palpitations, and that's like the bigger question. Like, what is that going to do later on? Why would you want to take like that risk? And this is really interesting. So they don't understand why the the Spanish flu specifically had that peak of the mortality in those healthy 20 to 40-year-olds. But one of the theories, and who actually wrote this, is Fauci. He actually has a paper on this. It's really fascinating. One of the theories was that because they were exposed to a prior virus, that left them vulnerable to this one. It's one of the many theories. And so it's like, yeah, like what if you get a COVID-19 infection? And I'll talk a little bit more about what we see with natural immunity, because I think it's important to discuss it. Like, what if that then leaves you primed for something later on? Like,
and I have to say that one thing, because I want you to say the natural immunity, but I want to explain what you just said, because my husband got a severe case of COVID. He's in his 40s, no pre-existing conditions, very fit, very healthy, got so sick we thought we were going to lose him twice. And he kissed me 2 hours before he got symptoms. He slept with the kids the night before. None of us got it. So what you're saying, like, I know it's a theory, but in a way it's like, maybe that just makes more sense, or maybe his immune system responds in a different way. But it was just so fascinating that I was with him 24/7 until he got so severely ill in the same house and cared for him. And none of us got sick. We got tested, we got the antibodies, didn't have any of those, but until we got obviously the vaccine. But that is fascinating to me. But
it's completely unpredictable. And it's like, why would you want to like play Russian roulette? Like, why would you want to play that with your health when you don't understand what the long-term implications of it are? And I think that that's really important to especially for young people who have so much of their life like left to live. Why would you want to be like sick with a comorbidity that's going to impact the quality of your life for many years to come? And so, and then in terms of natural immunity with like COVID-19, from a SARS-CoV-2 infection. So we're learning more, right? It is a good response. It's from the data that we have, we don't think it's better than, that elicited by mRNA. And there's several theories. Like the leading theory is that because there are all these inflammatory processes, right? When you are sick, because you have a whole virus, it's less likely that you're going to, elicit the antibodies that you need to, like the spike protein antibodies are much higher when you get a vaccine. Now, what's interesting, one theory is that there are what we call viral reservoirs. So there's like virus left in your body, right? And so what they found with like people with natural immunity from a prior infection is, oh, look, they may not produce more antibodies, but the breadth of the response is, let's call it broader than from an mRNA. But the reason for why that's happening is not a good one. It just means that there is a potential that there's just virus left in your body. And that is a little concerning. Like, what are the implications of that years down the road of having like viral and it is also one of the theories that is being investigated. People that are, Akiko Iwasaki, she's from Yale. She's looking at long COVID. She's one of the leading researchers looking at long COVID, because they're trying to understand what is happening. And that is one of their, I think they have like 3 theories, and I can't recall the other 2, but that's one of them, that there are, that we just have, that person who has an infection, there's like minute amounts of virus left in the body and in the tissues, and what are the implications of that down the road. So these are just things that we really want to consider. And I think, unfortunately, it seems like being healthy and I like to say the word like healthy in quotes. Like I always use it like quotes because that's a very nuanced, discussion around health, but it's almost as if like it's been being pitted against vaccination. Like, if you exercise and if you eat a certain way, and I'm like, well, why? Like you grew up with herd immunity from all other like all other diseases. In fact, the only reason we know what we know about nutrition and sports and all that is because we were able to contain all these other diseases, and now there's more research on all these other aspects. And as I said earlier, because we now live longer, lifestyle becomes more important. We have to acknowledge that. We know that lifestyle really reduces the risk. The right lifestyle reduces the risk of certain outcomes. But why are we living longer? Part of it is because we have like vaccines and public health. So it's just kind of like they're creating this false dichotomy. And I'm like, you realize that the reason you get to worry about your healthy lifestyle is because of public health and vaccination.
Absolutely. Right.
It's
a fascinating way to look at it.
That's what I did a post, my freedom post was about that. When I said to people, like, you have freedom because of public health. Like it's outrageous that people just don't really see that. And I, coming from a country that had less access to some of these resources, I'll tell you, like I grew up in the era of like Pablo Escobar, like like I was in like the 80s, and I recall like I wasn't allowed to like walk outside, like I wasn't allowed to just walk around the block at night because something could happen. It could be dangerous, right? There was a lot of crime, and I tell people like freedom is inherently tied to safety. Don't tell me that you're going to like embark on that adventure if you don't feel safe doing it. Because most people, that's the reason why people unfortunately now feel like they don't want to vaccinate. It's because they feel like the vaccines are unsafe, right? It's not tied to like but yeah, like your freedom is tied to your safety, and public health responses have made it safe for us. So you get to worry about your lifestyle because of vaccination, right? And so it shouldn't be pitted against each other. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, now we're getting to that time where a lot of us have been vaccinated 6, 7, 8 months. So now there's talk of the booster, right? So now with the booster, being offered more and more widely, I think a lot of people have questions. Like they want to know, okay, is this booster, A, is it necessary if I've already been fully vaccinated? B, is it just a third like step? Like, is it basically the same vaccine, but like a third dose, or is it something different, or will it affect me? Could it affect me, in a negative way if I get the booster now? So I think a lot of that kind of stuff is swirling too, if you can clarify that.
Yeah, let's totally talk about that. So we have to understand that this was, vaccine clinical trials were done during a pandemic, right? Like it's like, we're in the process of trying to develop a vaccine while people are dying, right? So there's a big trade-off there, right? And so, usually when you have like, your first dose, you call it your prime, your prime response, and then your boost response. And so I like to make an example, like if you have a tomato garden and you want to make this really nice tomato sauce, but your tomatoes are just not that ripe yet. But, like if you pick them too early, you might get tomato sauce sooner, but it might not be better. Whereas if you wait longer, those tomatoes, will ripen, and then you can get a better tomato sauce. So with your immune response, what happens is that when that first dose, right, your immune system sees, like the mRNA produces the spike protein, and you get those antibodies. But just like the virus evolves, our immune system has the ability of also kind of evolve, what we call antibody evolution. And so, your memory cells, they keep getting like smarter. And there are several studies now that continue that show continued evolution of those responses. People think that boosting is just increasing the antibodies, and it's a little bit more nuanced than that. What you're doing is you're picking those better tomatoes. So in order to pick the better tomatoes, you have to allow enough time to go by, right? And so like when you're boosting, you're actually telling the immune system, hey, I don't want all of you. Maybe I just want the best of you. But there's got to be a time of maturation. And so usually with children, you see that it's like, like a 2 month, like an 8-week window, but we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so they did it 3 weeks for Pfizer, 4 weeks for Moderna. And it could be feasible that we just needed to wait, have a longer interval to allow for more of that maturation to take place, so that when you boost with that second dose, right, you would get a better response of like the better cells get boosted, right? Like those better cells that produce the better antibodies. So that's something to always consider, right? Because that is like the trade-off of conducting a clinical trial during a pandemic while people are dying, right? And so that's one kind of idea of like, oh, maybe if we waited a little bit longer, like the response could have been a little bit more robust, because we allow affinity maturation, that's the process, we allow that to go on for a little bit longer. Or it could be that like other vaccines that have like 3 and 4 shots, the COVID-19 vaccine also requires 3 or 4 doses, right? So one of the things, I think, first of all, like with the booster, right, we know that when we get our shots, we produce antibodies. Antibodies are critical so that you don't get an infection, but antibodies wane. We know that, like even from a natural infection, you produce like your spike of IgGs and then they wane over time. And so like the bigger question is like, how long lasting is this booster, and what is the effect of waning antibodies, right? Which I don't really think of it as waning immunity. I just think it's part of like the natural immune response. Maybe that baseline, at which those antibodies plateaued before, was sufficient for the other strains that weren't as contagious, because they, there wasn't as much viral replication. Like, as I said, we have a lot more virus. It could be that now that baseline is insufficient to the extent that if you come in contact with the virus, you're going to, you are more likely to get an infection, but again, you have your wall built up. So, so then you really got to look at it at this from like different age groups when we talk about boosters, because younger people have an easier time building that wall just because of age, right? Immune system is more, is more robust. So when they get the 2 doses, they have a pretty strong wall. So maybe the antibody, levels are low. They might get a breakthrough infection, but they're not going to get severely sick. But with an older demographic, or a demographic that is immunocompromised, they have a harder time building that wall, even from vaccination. And so it may be that for that demographic, giving that booster, again, it's like you're taking these really great cells, let's boost those, right? Elicit a better response. Let's build up a stronger wall. And the initial data from Israel looks fantastic, but it's still data that we're gathering like in real time. So it's not data that has been around for very long. I think we have maybe like a month of data. I think they started their booster program like at the end of July. So not a lot of time. We know that it's working to prevent infection. It has worked to the response against severe disease. We don't know how long, but it's done so mainly in the older demographic. You don't see a huge change against severe disease in those under like 50 or 60 in Israel. You see it in the older demographic where they need more. They need like more help in building that wall, because the wall is what really keeps you from going to a hospital, right? Like if you don't have enough antibodies, those, your memory immune responses, so like your B cells and your T cells, which are going to be there, they're the ones who are going to kind of like, get an alert message and say, hey, we know what to do. Like we have like we have the information to make like the antibodies. So even without antibodies, you have like a strong response there. And I just think it's been, unfortunately, just not been communicated properly, because you hear all these like reports, right? It's like, oh, vaccines aren't working. There's all these breakthrough infections, but but you're clearing the virus a lot faster. You still have that wall, but yeah. So there's a little bit of nuance with that, and the data is still pretty fresh in as far as how durable the response is going to be in that older demographic. When we look at safety, so safety data from Israel looks really good. They've administered boosters to almost 3 million people. There's only been one report of myocarditis. But again, you have to be careful with that, because at the same time, most of the population they've boosted has been an older demographic. So until we get more data on the younger, we'll have a better idea of whether or not there's a higher risk of myocarditis. So far, they as of like a week ago, they hadn't reported a single instance of myocarditis in the young teen demographic. And overall, the response seems to be milder than the second dose. But again, those results could be skewed because it's an older demographic that has gotten the booster relative to like, a much broader and younger demographic.
So our time's almost up, and thank you so much for being here and sharing your knowledge and wisdom and analysis and data. What about now? Like where we're sitting right now with COVID, what do you see from your expertise is going to be the future? Because I said to my husband recently, I was like, you know what? I just feel like people who aren't going to get vaccinated at some point are just not going to get vaccinated. So either people are just going to get COVID, some sadly are going to pass away, and some are going to get some kind of immune response. It's going to probably take a hell of a lot longer than it could have, maybe years. So I'm like, what do you see the future with COVID? Do you think that it's going to take years? And do you think there's just going to be a lot more deaths until we kind of get this handled?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that's part of it, right? If we don't have a population that has protection, there will unfortunately be more death. I do like what I'm seeing more in as far as the vaccine equity. So, there more doses are going to the lower and middle income nations, which I think is really important, because we also want to prevent new emerging variants, right? I mean, we take a look at the variants, they've emerged every single time, like you let the virus run rampant, you get a terrible new variant. So that's important. I think COVID, it's endemic. We know already it's going to be endemic. I think that, and I did a post on this, like, how does it end? I do see the trajectory that it will become like a childhood disease, like chickenpox, right? Like, this is what, but that is under the, like the assumption that the majority of the adult population, now has some type of immunity to it, right? With Delta, it's so transmissible that we need, like, I think the threshold is like 95% of like, immunity. We are also, there's also other things. So, we also have to consider that just because this is the vaccination schedule that we have now, it might change, right? So they're working on other vaccines. There are, and I haven't talked much about it, but really to prevent an infection, you need what we call mucosal immunity. So you need it to be in your airway. So for instance, with other diseases, the reason you don't get the infection is because in order for you to get sick, it has to get to your blood, but your antibodies are in your blood. But here it's like the first route of exposure is your nasal cavity, right? So so intranasal vaccines, I know they're working on that. There is another strategy, which is called the prime and pull strategy. So there will be other interventions. There are also a couple of therapeutics that are being explored, like, for treatments that are showing, some promise, including like an antidepressant. I'm not sure if you heard about that, fluvoxamine. Yeah, like I don't know how they stumbled onto it, but I think it's in phase 3 right now. And I know Pfizer also, interestingly, also has an oral medication. So there will be other, kind of like routes of intervention outside of vaccination. I'm a huge advocate of rapid testing. Like I've been saying it for like a year and a half. I said, if everybody just had like a rapid test that plugged to their phone, like, that would, that would like, it's kind of interesting because, my husband was working with a company that was kind of interested in that. And I'm talking to other people, like, how do we, we could make these guys, like, how can we not make like the sensor, because I think rapid testing is really, imagine it being like a daily ritual, like you brush your teeth. Hey, you wake up every couple of days, you take a little test, and from there, that really, especially with Delta, where there's a lot more virus present, so it makes those tests a lot more sensitive. I think that could also be a viable strategy to, to kind of move things along, so that we don't have to wait till like 95% of the population has like some type of immunity. Because, as we wait, more children are born, right? So that kind of also changes, right? But when I worked with Charlotte, and she's an epidemiologist from the UK, we kind of, we did a post on this. It's called "How Does It End?" And we kind of said, it's most likely going to turn into like a childhood disease, but it's going to take a while for us to get there, and we need other layers of risk mitigation. As we go through the waves, I think, like checking the weather, you're going to check like your risk level in your community, like, oh, well, if there's less than one case per 100,000, I am good to go. Maybe I can go outside and learn how to layer those different strategies. Like something that we got from like the 1918 like Spanish flu pandemic was this idea of washing our hands, right? Like people now wash their hands more, right? So I mean, people talk about like, oh, are masks going to be like a new thing? Like every time you feel like a little sick, like we know that it works. Japan, China, Singapore, all these countries regularly wear masks. That's just part of their norm. And that's, one of the different intervention strategies they have for other infectious pathogens, even before COVID. But I think one of the reasons this is challenging, it's because, first of all, this doesn't happen really often, right? It's just like once every like several decades, 100 years. And then we're also living through it in a time of, heightened politicization of the events. And of course, social media, fake news travels a lot faster, is more far reaching, broader reaching than information, that reliable sources of information. And it just makes it really, really challenging. And I think those are one of the things that we really want to like address as time goes by. That's why I do what I do, and other people also do what I do, is to try to kind of curb that other aspect, which has much more far-reaching implications, even outside of like the COVID-19 pandemic, and like what it means for health outcomes in general.
I was going to say, I think we're already seeing those changes, and Tam, and I think you've seen it too, is even in work life, how it's changed everything. Because like, goodness, I know for me, I have my first big red carpet that I'm doing tomorrow night, like
in person,
but I had to go today and get my test, like 72 hours, you have to get it before you appear on the carpet, and you have to present your vaccination card. And I know with you, Tammin, on set,
right,
like, you have to take your COVID tests. And
they're now saying that you can't even be on set. Like I just got a thing that said, the audition, you can only audition for this if you're vaccinated, 100% vaccinated set. So there won't even be sets that will be even open to people who aren't vaccinated. And I understand how people think that takes away their freedom. But then I also understand, if I was putting the money into a project and the project had to be shut down for 2 weeks, I might not have that money to pay for that, and yes, you can still get COVID, but again, it's a much less likely chance that you will. So it's a less likely chance that production would have to be shut down, so it is a difficult thing to say. But you're saying work life, Roxy, because also like so much of it's now going to be like this as well. Like, do we need everything to be a meeting? Do we need everything to see? I mean, auditions will be on tape, I think, probably for the rest of time. Like, why are actors going in and spending half their day driving to places where we could just do it over tape?
It's just so much easier.
And telehealth, that's here to stay. So I'm good friends with a guy who sold his telehealth company like a year ago for a lot of money, and that's here to stay. The way we work, the way we travel, like, working from home, even like living, like, does this mean that people can have like a more nomadic life and like travel from country to country?
We have been on the road for a year.
Right? And how will that impact housing? Are people going to be like, there's all these different aspects of it. And I think, usually, this represents, of course, COVID-19 pandemic represents a loss for many people, the loss of life, but it's also opening like so much opportunity. One of the things that I see that is really fascinating is that now there is a lot of research now going into long COVID, which plays into chronic fatigue syndrome and all these other things that have gone by unaddressed, because it's probably very similar. Why do people feel that they have chronic fatigue after certain infections, right? And so it's just kind of fascinating how it's also going to open opportunities for like housing and business and testing and all these other aspects that we just, and that's kind of like a lot of what I do. Like, I'm just always kind of like thinking creative solutions. Here's our reality. Let's think about creative solutions. And let's be a little bit smarter about how we think of the risks associated with that. Because I think that, as a person who loves technology, I will tell you that I do feel that that's something that has been lacking in the past, is proper insight. What are the ramifications of introducing like this technology? Like, iPhones are great, but it's also a great conduit for misinformation, right? So these are all things to think about, but it's definitely transformative.
Yeah, I will say, I wish I bought stock in Zoom in February 2020.
Oh, freaking doodle. Zoom and all of so many Postmates probably went up like crazy.
Wow.
Yes, wow. I know, right? Yeah. Oh,
do you remember, Roxy, when they were like Zoom, and I'm like, Zoo what? It's like, I can't even figure out how to turn my computer on, let alone have conversations and tape it on a podcast.
Oh my God. And do you remember when we were doing like the Zoom and like the secondary like sound? We had so many things going on. We were like, and now look
my
at
parents
us.
didn't even know how to turn it on. I mean, it's definitely Thank God. You know what? Thank God for technology, especially during like the Spanish flu would have been a whole different experience. I mean, like, at least we were able to connect with each other, albeit over technology, but at least there was a way to like see people and feel less alone and less isolated, because I can't even imagine even kids doing school. I mean, there's always things that aren't great about social media and technology, but I think for the most part it does give us more than it takes. So
yeah,
thank you so much, Nini.
Thank you, Nini.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you. And
for having me.
Yeah.
And where can we find you and people can ask questions? Please let them know where they can find out more information.
Yeah. So I am at Nini and the Brain. That's my Instagram handle, and that's where I am most active. And then whenever you have a question, just feel free to like send me a DM. I'm always happy to answer questions or send you a post that might answer your question, because I've probably done a post on it already. And this week we're actually talking mostly about distortions, like distortions in thinking and how we fail to like. I'm working with a dermatologist, and we're looking at all these risks from fillers and Botox, and I'm like reading through them, and I'm like, man, this makes vaccines look like a walk in the
park. I'm like, I had a friend who went blind a little bit for like a week. Yeah. And I'm like, what? I've never heard someone go blind from the vaccine.
Yeah, I was like reading the papers, and I was like, all right.
Botox is probably a hell of a lot worse for you.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say too, if COVID made you had like boils and goiters, all over
if
your
it made
face,
you attractive, then
you better believe everyone would get that vaccine.
If it made you wealthy, or thin or pretty, I promise you, they would be spending the money and lining up. That's sad about it.
Fascinating. It is fascinating to see how we evaluate risk, right? And it's just like, oh wow, like we. I think it has to do also with the idea of again, the absence of disease from an invisible virus versus that immediate gratification of fixing something that you're able to see right away. But we'll be talking about that this week. That should be a fun conversation, fun post.
So everyone should
Amazing,
check that
guys.
out.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope that answered some of your questions. And don't forget to follow us on Women on Top Official on Instagram.
And Women on Top podcast on Facebook and the Women on Top group on Clubhouse. And don't forget to rate,
subscribe,
and comment on your favorite podcast app about us so we can keep bringing you amazing
guesses like Nini. See, it's almost like we wrote that out. And thanks guys for listening. I'm Tammin Sursock.
And I am Roxy Manning.
And we are Women on. Make it good, Rox.
Bye.
That was a little saucy.